Afternoon. Um, as you all probably heard, we will be recording this meeting for those of us who can't join us in the book club. This is the second installment of our Earthseed Book Club. My name is Isabel Ling, and I'm the senior editor at Mold Magazine, and I'm joined by Linny Yuan, who's the editor-in-chief, as well as Stephen Reid, one of our contributors. We're really excited to have you all here with us today. So to give you some background, this book club is an extension of the Earthseed editorial series we've been publishing at Mold across the past couple of months, where we've asked designers, earth workers, and scholars to respond to the parable of the sower, the first novel in the parable series by Octavia Butler. As those of you who are reading along might know, the book's future post-apocalyptic world begins in 2024, which is our present. So on occasion of this date, we've decided to make and revisit the story that Octavia has written, and we're peering deeper into the sci-fi world that many have called prophetic. So this week we're spending time with chapters 9 through 13. We had our first meeting last week in person at WSA, where we sort of dove into Octavia's world building and her ideas around seed saving. And this week we're joined by Stephen Reid, an assistant curator at the Huntington Library, where Octavia Butler's archives are currently stored, as well as the head gardener of the library's Rose Garden. So in addition to his work at the Huntington, Stephen is also a Los Angeles resident and California native plant landscaper who is an avid home gardener. So before we get started, since we're in a Zoom format now, I wanted to set some ground rules. Stephen will be presenting about the piece that he wrote for the Earthseed series, and then we'll break out into discussion. And so when we go into discussion, if you'd like to contribute, we ask that you use the React button and raise your hand, and then you can go ahead and speak. Cool. Thank you so much. So I'll let you get started, Stephen.
All right, cool. Excuse me. Can everybody hear me? Yes. All right, great. So thank you, Isabel, for having me. I'm really glad to be here and really glad I got to write the piece for Mold Magazine. It was really therapeutic to write and really also interesting delving into Octavia's pieces being so close to a lot of her work here in the archives at the Huntington. And also it being 2024 and Lauren's story taking place in Southern California. So yeah, you can go to the next slide, Isabel. So I mentioned a couple of ways that I found resonance with Octavia and some of her work. As I mentioned earlier, here at the Huntington, we have Octavia's archives that documents a lot of her life and her work and her travels. So I included a couple of pictures from our archives here at the Huntington of Octavia and her travels and some of her work. So this is a picture of Octavia when she traveled to Peru to conduct some of her research for Xenogenesis, Lilith's Blood trilogy, which I haven't read yet, but I do have on my list. And it takes place in a post-apocalyptic rainforest and alien space vessel. So that's one picture that we have from the Huntington Library. Really cool, and you see Octavia there amongst all of the different formations. And you can go to the next one, please. And this is the outside of an envelope that Octavia used to file away the articles collected on climate and environment, on the climate and environment beginning in the 1980s. So it's really cool to see some of her notes and read some of the things that her thoughts and some of the photos of her. So if you ever get a chance to come to Southern California and visit the archives, especially if you're interested in Octavia and a lot of her work, highly, highly recommend it. And spending a couple of days and seeing Octavia's work and a lot of other cool stuff that we have in the library. Um, so on top of the Huntington Library, like I mentioned earlier, the year being 2024, me being a gardener and advocating for change through climate resilience and understanding that the seasons change and almost nature and gardening is almost making change as a god, similar to Lauren did. Because you come to expect it when a plant grows. It grows from a seed, it matures, it fruits, then it dies. You don't really expect a plant to live forever. So you're already looking at an aspect of change when you're looking at gardening. All right, we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So before I go into some of my work here in California, because I know some of you are are tuning in from different areas of the country or the world, I wanted to give an overarching look at some of the specific climate issues that Southern California is facing as a result of climate change. So one of the major issues that we face in California, which a lot of you may have heard about, is our drought. So we've been experienced persistent droughts with lower than average rainfalls. Even though we've had a good amount of rainfall over the last 2 years above average, overall it still leaves us in a drought, and that's how much of a of less than the surplus that we've had. Climate change has excavated these results, making it harder for ecosystems and urban areas to support themselves, to sustain themselves and support themselves. So we can go to the next slide too. And drought is one of the main things that we're combating, especially using different landscaping and planting techniques, which I'll go over a little bit later. Wildfires is another one, which a lot of you may have seen and heard about over the news if you don't live in California. The 2021 and 2020 wildfire seasons were particularly severe, destroying vast areas of forest, homes, and wildlife habitats. This year, if you live in Los Angeles, or you may have seen on the news, there was a lot of wildfires that were surrounding Los Angeles. And if you were in LA, it was really interesting. You can see these really big clouds, almost look like a nuclear bomb had gone off, similar to this photo, and just kind of like a huge mushroom cloud of smoke and fire that was burning. So it was really, really crazy to see. So it is something that we deal with a lot here. And you can go to the next slide too, please. Another thing which is we combat a lot here in Southern Cali, especially with so many people living in such a dense urban area, is urban heat islands, where a lot of these very urban dense areas experience much higher temperature than the surrounding rural areas. And that's also excavated by the lack of tree canopies in a lot of these areas, where there's just not many trees to mitigate the amount of heat reflecting off of the concrete, and there's not enough shade. A lot of that oxygen and carbon dioxide transition isn't happening, so we get a lot of urban heat islands, which increases the heat in those specific areas and causes higher costs, much more water use, and a lot more discomfort in those neighborhoods. And interestingly enough, it's typically in underserved neighborhoods or Black or brown neighborhoods that you see a lot of these urban heat islands. But there are a lot of good um, programs that are combating that, like one called Tree People, which goes into neighborhoods like this and plants new trees and takes care of them, hoping to combat that urban heat island. All right, we can go to the next slide. And finally, one thing that's kind of compiled into everything with our climate change is habitat loss. Droughts and wildfires are destroying our native habitats like the chaparral, coastal sage scrub, and forests, forcing wildlife to migrate or perish. The loss of plant diversity affects everything from birds to pollinators and bees and like bees and butterflies. So, because of wildfires, because of droughts, because of human destruction, we're killing a lot of these native plant habitats and food that provide food and habitat for a lot of our native animals and bugs. And that really destroys the cycle of pollination, destroys the cycle of life for a lot of our plants and animals, because they're not able to use those plants as food or as a resource in order to raise their families. So habitat loss is something that we have to mitigate a lot, especially through landscape design and conscious and intentful planting. You can go to the next one. So similar to Lauren in Parable of the Sower, she saw a lot of these issues and a lot of these things happening. So she took it upon herself to see how she can lead herself into the people that she was around into a better situation, understanding that God has changed and understanding that the environment was falling apart around here with climate change. Political uprisings are happening, a lot of political violence, and she used nature in order to be her guide, in order to guide people through the changes that were happening. So I tried to, not intentionally, but did a lot of the same things that I did that Lauren did when she came here and when she was here in Southern California, but when I came in Southern California. And another interesting thing, going back to Octavia Butler and the resonance that I had with her, she's actually from Pasadena as well, which is where the Huntington Library is located. So that was another kind of connection there. But either way, the rehab that I did was in my yard in Watts, California, which after COVID, we bought a small house in Watts, California, which was about 980 square feet of patchy yard, front yard, backyard, and verge. So like I mentioned, like Lauren, I noticed that and kind of heard that California was in a drought and that a lot of people really love their lawns and their grasses in California. And one thing that grasses and lawns love is water, which California doesn't have too much of. So the state is actually working with homeowners and businesses to provide rebates for replacing your lawn and your different non-water friendly plants with drought tolerant and native species and using mulch and different native grasses to replace your lawn. So I actually heard about this and wanted to make a change in my community. So if and none of you are familiar with Watts, it's one of the most infamous neighborhoods, I guess, for gang violence and in Southern California. So gardening definitely and landscaping isn't something that they were used to or familiar with in that area. Outside of a lot of the like South American or Mexican neighbors that I have that grew a lot of traditional plants like guava or avocados. There wasn't really much gardening or landscaping taking place, especially native landscaping. So I decided that I wanted to kind of, like Lawrence, be an example and lead the community towards something that was a little bit more sustainable and something that I can share with them, whether through visual aesthetics or by giving pieces and cuttings of whatever I was growing at the time around them, building that community. So this is how my lawn started when we first moved in. I applied for the rebate and was able to get the rebate. And it was about $2 or $3 per square foot that the government was giving you. And I think I got like about $3,000 back after I did the rebate. So you can go to the next slide. It was this patchy grass. I got about 3 or 4 people to help me remove the grass. I did a technique called lasagna composting, where you put down a layer of mulch, you put down some painter's paper, cardboard, and another layer of compost, and you plant on top of the compost, sorry, you put wood and leaf chip mulch and you plant your plants directly through that. And all of that decomposes into making this really, really nice soil. It rehabilitates the native soil that's on the bottom and then really builds the soil for the new plants that you're planting in. So this growth is about 1.5 to 2 years in, and a few different iterations of the garden. Um, One of the rules was that you have to have 3 plants per 100 square feet, and you also have to have a water saving feature. Now, if you kind of look a little bit over the orange flowers, which are California poppies, which in the background is California mugwort, you see a little bit of rocks. And I'll show a better picture of that a little bit later, but what that's called is a rock line swale. And swales and are usually ways that you can stop, slow, and spread water from getting into the streets. And then you can spread that water, that the rainwater. Again, California, we don't get much rain. So it's important to save as much rainwater that we can. So instead of using like a rain cistern or a rain barrel, you can use rocks coming down from the gutters of your house to slow that water and spread it into the plants that are in your garden. And typically around swales, we want to plant plants that like wet feet, meaning they don't mind being in water, or they don't mind being a little bit more wet than a lot of other plants. As most Southern California native plants are different in the sense that they don't like summer water. They usually go dormant in the summer and will die if you feed them or give them water in the summertime, unlike a lot of other plants. But these plants along the swale do like wet feet because a lot of those rocks and soil in that area collects the water. So you can go to the next slide. So this is a picture taken by Saxon Holt, who I met at the Huntington, and he visited my property. Saxon is a world-renowned photographer that his work has been featured in many books and magazines, and he's known for taking pictures of like native plants and plants. A lot of books that you may have seen that are plant books, especially if they're based on the West Coast, a lot of the photos were probably taken by him. And he stopped by. I think this was in like the midwinter, maybe in like January, and he took a picture of the garden and kind of one of my favorite pictures, just kind of freezing the garden in place. And in the front, you see Salvia gregii, and then in the back behind that pink salvia is agave attenuata. Neither of those are native, but they're both drought tolerant. I believe the salvia is autumn sage, and it's native to Texas, and then the agaves are always drought tolerant. You can go to the next slide. This was a little close up. Over time, I built different pathways and used different natural items like rocks or stones that I found, logs and stuff that I found at work in order to build different pathways and different highlights of the garden. One thing I did want to make sure outside of growing food and native plants, because I have a base and kind of my basis of my plant knowledge started with herbalism and medicine making. So many of the things that I planted were specific for herbal use, tea, or for medicine. So that first yellow flower that you see in the front is actually calendula. And calendula is a really excellent plant for any type of skin condition, rashes, eczema, psoriasis, or anything that kind of results into inflammation or infection of the skin. The calendula resina is a very special variety that has a lot more resin than most of your calendula flowers. So it's a lot more potent than when you're making an oil or you're making a salve from it. So I planted that and a few other herbs like thyme and parsley that thrived around the garden and planted it ground. My kind of garden theory for building gardens is that I like to have the food and the herbs kind of in a natural setting in the garden versus in the garden bed. So you can kind of walk through the garden and pick something. Like you can walk through the garden and pick a rose, or walk through the garden and pick a berry or an herb. And it just makes a more pleasant experience versus having everything compiled in one section. So this photo is of the calendulas, aeoniums, and in the background is a green, evergreen shrub. You can kind of see it actually has these beautiful red flowers in the late summer, mid to late summer, but its Latin name is Eriogonum grande variety rubescens, but the common name is red buckwheat. So it has these red, beautiful flowers. And even when the flowers dry, they're still really pretty and make a really good flower in an arrangement. So we can go to the next slide. So if you press play, I actually naturally, since I work in a rose garden, I started a little rose garden on the back corner. So you can see the couple of roses I have in the back climbing up of that pole. There's morning glory, which definitely you don't want to plant in your garden. It reseeds and takes over and gets really weedy and viney, but I let it grow just because I wanted to cover up that back part. So when I took it down, I actually put up another climbing rose up in that section. But so the rose that you first see, that really deep pink one, is called the Pretty Lady Rose. And then the one that we're kind of scrolling over to now is called Rosa Perfume Factory. And both of them just smell fantastic, make really good cut roses. And yeah, just built a little rose section. And the bottom of that, I put a ground cover of geraniums that you can see beyond, under the roses. And you can go to the next section. All right, and this is me just kind of tending to the garden. That really bright orange plant to on my right hand side is called wild daga, or Leontis leonuris, I believe is the Latin name. And it's a really beautiful plant, but also medicinal. In the Caribbean, they use the flowers for fever and for any infection in the body. But what it's most commonly known for is being used in smoke blends and herbal smoke blends. It can be used as a marijuana replacement, and in some countries in Africa, they use it as a marijuana replacement. And some people say it does get you a little bit high. So don't take my word for it. And I'm not saying to try it, but that is what it says it does. And then you see, oh, sorry, go back one more time. You see that those rocks in front of me, that's the rock line swale. So the California mugwort, which is poking in front of it, is a dreaming herb which you can use to help with your dreams and intuition. But it really likes wet feet, so I planted it next to the swale, and that kind of leads up to the gutters on the side of the house to help slow and spread that water. All right, you can go to the next slide. And this was the garden bed that I made. So I made two 4x4 raised garden beds and filled them with compost and soil. And seasonally, I would grow different vegetables. I'm not sure what's here. I think this is sweet peas and spinach and a little bit of kale. And then the big one is purple cauliflower. So I had two of those that were 4x4, and I would grow vegetables and herbs, just not only for me and my family, but for the neighborhood, and giving them out to different neighborhood people in the neighborhood. And kind of trying to make a change in my neighborhood, not like I mentioned earlier, not only through that aesthetic value and showing different water saving ideas, but through organic gardening and showing people that you can do the revolutionary act of creating and growing your own food, saving money and growing organic food from having to go to the grocery store and getting the healthiest items. So you can go to the next slide. So uh, long story short, I had to move out of my family home probably about 6 months ago because of divorce. And probably about 2 months ago, all of the plants that I planted over the last 2 years and tended to over the last 2 years after I moved out were removed from the home. So as you can imagine, that was a pretty big change and something that was almost like a loss of a family member, because I cared for each one of those plants. I knew all their names. Some of them had kids, like some of the aloes I had kids, and then I planted those in some other places. And then those kids had kids, so I had like generations of aloes in the yard. But either way, all of them were removed, and I had to move out of the family home. And that was a huge change. And one thing that I found that was as I lost that garden, and it's almost like pruning roses. When you prune those roses, the dead roses that fall off of that are on the rose bush, the plant can direct more energy towards growing a lot of those new blooms. And that stuck with me, remembering that sometimes when you cut off those dead things, whether it's a relationship, whether even if it's a beautiful garden that maybe keeps you at the top of your potential, losing those things sometimes opens you up for moving energy towards things that matter. And again, like Lauren, it's not just about the plants and the environment, it's also about building community that are centered around that one goal. So another way that I rehab the environment is through helping kids connect to gardening and getting those touch points early. So I started building gardens at after school and community gardens. This one is at an after school program at the Santa Monica Police Activities League. I helped them start up their garden, and now it's going on the second season. They have two garden beds. We just planted a native wildflower patch in that back corner where the fences are. And the kids are really enjoying it. And again, it's getting those touch points early, even though it may not stick with them. It's something that they can say that they've done and that they have experience in for the future. And you can go to the next slide. This is another program I'm working with. This is an anti-recidivism program. I'm the lead teacher, gardening teacher, and mindfulness teacher at this garden. What happens is a lot of these men are recently released from prison, probably some as of, I think that's Joseph. He was in prison probably for about 4 or 5 years, and he went back in and just came out after this photo. So they go to this house to where they kind of get back on their feet, and they have these different sessions at this house where they can get paid to go learn different things. So they're getting paid essentially to come out and learn mindfulness and gardening from me. So the curriculum that I set up was very from the bottom up, and I wanted to relate gardening to how they can adjust and adjust these things into their lives. So the first class was about clearing all the garden beds from the last season and refreshing all the beds and moving everything out. And the lesson was about how can we start new now that you're out of prison? How can we start fresh and clear the ground for yourself? And today I'll actually be teaching the second lesson where now that we've cleared the ground and we've talked about how we can start new, we're going to talk about how we can condition the soil and build ourselves to build a strong base in order for ourselves to grow. So we're going to talk about that, but then at the same time, we're going to condition the soil, adding compost, adding mulch, and making sure that our soil is strong enough for our plants to grow throughout the winter. So connecting those lessons of life with lessons of growth in the garden. So even though I lost that garden that was serving the community, I ended up gaining so many more gardens that I can work on. Not only that, I do landscape design, and I was able to get just a plethora of different landscape design clients that came, and all of them are specifically working on native landscapes and drought tolerant features. So I'm really able to build the gardens that I want, help the community that I want, and fight towards environmental justice and kind of live out my purpose through the different changes that happen. And that was through me accepting that change and going with it, and then keeping my mind open to see what else would happen. One of my favorite things is saying, keep a mind that's open to everything, but attached to nothing. And that's kind of how I went through the process with an open mind, but not attached to any specific outcomes. And now I'm still going through my journey and being able to build different green spaces, connect underserved communities to the benefits and joys of gardening, and connect myself to gardening where it serves as a sense of peace and purpose, and as a respite from like the busy city and the different things that we have going on as busy people. So yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you guys for listening.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Um, if we can go to the slide. I guess that we just listened to Stephen's amazing presentation about how the practice of gardening has helped him adapt to and manage change. This is from we're gonna go into the portion of the talk now where we're sort of diving into the reading that we've all been doing. So if you'd like to contribute, please hop in. So this passage is from chapter 11. It says, all successful life is adaptable, opportunistic, tenacious, interconnected, and fecund. Understand this, use it, shape God. And I think that it really relates to what Stephen's just told us about, not only gardening and adapting to our landscape, but also how we should approach handling a changing environment as well and changes within our own life. So one of my first questions, one of my first questions is, Jenna, did you have something to say? If you did, you can go ahead and hop in if you have to respond before we continue with this question. No. Okay. Well, I'll continue. I guess my question is how have I wonder if anyone in the chat has had their own gardening practice and how it's maybe helped them manage change in their own lives or in their own gardens. Um, Feel free to hop in. Um, if well, maybe we can talk a little. Stephen, you were talking about the you were talking about how gardening helped you manage change. If we could go back to the first slide, Lee. Um, I wonder if anyone has to had turned to the environment to adapt to climate change or interactions with nature. Yeah, go ahead, fine.
Hi. So I live in Eastern Washington, so I don't know if y'all are familiar with the area, but it's very dry here and getting drier all the time. Probably pretty similar to California. And I am in a position where I have to rent. I don't own a house, but I still find myself wanting to make the ecosystem better, to have food there for people who come after me, like renting this property, and then also making sure that like the insect life and the native species here have the ability to subsist here, I guess, long after it stops becoming a lawn. And I have seen like such a huge transformation in like the property itself. The water use is down significantly, even though I've only done it in small areas. And it actually lowered our heating or sorry, no, our cooling bill in the summer because I planted corn along one side of the place that we're renting and it shaded out the entire house and kept it cool. So if we ever I guess it fixed the heat index a little bit. So I just wanted to share that yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Cool. That's amazing. The corn installation sounds awesome. I've never thought about that before.
It was actually a Three Sisters garden and it was prolific. It was amazing.
Cool. Anyone else have their own gardening stories to share?
I just wanted to add to what Fian said. The Three Sisters garden is when you grow corn, beans, and squash, and they all kind of support each other, growing with the corn growing upwards and the beans crawling up the corn, and then the squash sitting on the ground, adding the ground cover.
Yeah. Linny, you were saying, Ariel says, I'll just read this and then Lynn, you can go. I work as a therapist and use Change in the Woods where I work in the UK in our volunteer-run garden to talk about change and love. Your description of pruning and clearing the ground for change and new beginnings, Stephen. I guess it relates to that. Cool. Yeah, Lynn, you were gonna say something.
Oh, I was just gonna say that I really love both this kind of um passage about being opportunistic and tenacious
Mm.
and also interconnected because I think about my relationship with mugwort. When I
Mhm.
first moved to my home in Brooklyn, uh I just noticed that like the mugwort took over every spring. Like it was just like nonstop, and I would like really try to like clear the ground. And mugwort is a rhizomatic uh plant, so you really have to like uproot it, and even if there's like a little piece left, it will still like reroot and appear again in the next season. And then when I actually started like thinking a little bit about why it was there and my potential relationships with it, and I really appreciated, Stephen, that you kind of started your kind of relationship with plants through medicine. I started thinking about like this weed as a medicine, and to think about understanding it and thinking about it as an invitation in some ways to think about why it was there. And so, yeah, I just thought that like once I understood that, I started looking forward to mugwort coming up in the spring, and I always thought about it as the first sign of spring. I started cooking with it and feeding it to myself and my children. We even like have now like unfolded like a couple of different mugwort classes as part of our nature school here in Brooklyn. And I think that this passage that from Earthseed, where it talks about the interconnectedness, understanding it, and then using it, like those kind of actions that unfold from like recognizing the opportunistic, tenacious, and interconnected nature of things, then can like you turn the page and then you're like, okay, I understand. And then you can turn the page again and like use it. And I think that that's really powerful when you think about our relationship with plants and medicine.
Totally. Yeah, there's just it's I think so much of attitude around change is kind of like um making a friend out of change and understanding how it can, and it seems like mugwort was something that helped you um measure and adapt to change as well.
Yeah,
We can go to
so
the next question if oh
jump
yeah,
in
go
my knee really quick. I relate to the mugwort because when I was living in Brooklyn, I had mugwort was growing all around me too, and I have pictures of my little apartment, and there's probably just like 15 bundles of mugwort hanging up to dry on like the wall because I was doing the same thing, using them for oils and teas and all that. So shout out to mugwort.
Shout out to mugwort. Okay, we can move on to this question. So in this section of the book, chapters 9 through 13, Lauren starts to see her community start to unravel. You see violence, you see the political unrest that's happening. They live in a, for those of you who maybe haven't read, Lauren lives in a commune. It's a compound. They have high walls. They have like a really strong, tight-knit neighborhood, and that's what allows them to sort of ward off the chaos that's bred outside of their walls. But you start to see those walls start to crumble a bit. And so you have people breaking in, people setting fires, people stealing, sort of sowing discord. And there's a lot of um, different reactions that the community members have to it. So the question I have for the next is what are some ways you see the characters' relationship with the walls that surround them and the outside world change? And how do you sort of see these different approaches pop up in how our communities, or we collectively think and talk about the uncertainty of climate change? Yeah, go ahead, Vinny.
I also really love this question, and I also think a little bit going back to, not to make it all about mugwort, but I'm like thinking about, Stephen, your focus on native species and this kind of idea of the invader and the invasive. Because to your point, Isabel, like the compound that Lauren and her family live on, it's really just her neighbors on the street that they lived on, right? Like, and there was a kind of trust inherent in being neighbors and living inside. And then like so much energy was about like protecting the boundaries of that and keeping change out. And so obviously they were like existing in this like hyper violent, very unstable, there's addiction happening that's driving people to act in like very unstable ways. Like it's the I like love that picture that from the archive at Huntington, that's like Octavia making notes on her draft to being like more violence, like it needs to be like so extreme. But yeah, I wonder, this is more of a question like about our relationship with native species versus opportunistic or invasive species, and the ways that that then balances with climate change, right? So,
Mm.
and this is kind of a question back to you, Stephen, like how you're thinking about it in real time.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think um, what's interesting is that there have been a few non-native species that have actually naturalized themselves to Southern California. One of them is one of our fan palms, our palm trees. The palm trees that we have here actually aren't native to California. They were brought in, and so they definitely weren't natural. But one thing that was interesting is that there was, I believe, a parrot or a parakeet from Mexico that migrated up to Southern California, and they actually found a home in those palm trees. So now whenever you see a lot of those palm trees in Southern California and you hear these really loud parrots just kind of like squawking in those trees and eating like the fruit and the nectar in them. So it's interesting in that, like Linny, you were saying that they built this kind of inclusive community to, or exclusive, I should say, to keep everybody else out and keep change out. But sometimes change is good in the sense that um, if you let new things in, they can adapt to that current environment and add to it because now those parrots add to the sound and the escape of the city. They're out there pollinators. They help move things along within the natural process. So they added to that change instead of took away from it. So I think it's a good lesson. And sometimes when you let those walls down, and you see what happens, you can kind of synthesize something that isn't necessarily going the exact same way that you want and make it into something that's uniform and expansive.
Totally. Eco Art Space says that Arundodonax is another rhizome-based plant. Arundodonax is another rhizome-based plant that is considered invasive and not native, yet covers almost the entire planet today. Interesting. Yeah, I think that something that was resonant to me is like and kind of goes back to this idea around like native and non-native plants is Lauren at one point talks about how she thought change was going to be one big explosion, and that does happen and later in the book, but also she acknowledges that change is happening in small ways as well, like um in people leaving the community or her own brother deciding to go out and he also leaves, but like providing for the community in a way that's violent, where he becomes the antagonizer to other communities as well. And so I think that this idea is an interesting way of understanding how like our ideas around what change needs to be happening can be so diverse and out of our own control. And like um they it can you can never you can never expect what sort of change occurs, just how you react to it. Um, cool. Did anyone else have anything to add to this question before we move on to the next one? Okay.
Oh, I just wanted to flag that Eco Art Space also flagged that this language around invasive, non-native is based in military thinking and racism. And I think
Mm,
that especially in the kind of moment where we are uh witnessing and funding a genocide, so much I realize of the language that we use in like capitalism is very much rooted in kind of military like language, or like the language of like colonialism and empire. So even things like coming down the pipeline, or like, like
mhm.
it's wild to me.
Yeah.
Wanted to add on that too really quick. It's in horticulture especially, there's a lot of the signs of colonialism within plants. There's a lot of stories with plants being stolen and brought over from different countries, similar to people, even within roses. So there is a lot of interesting stories of racism and colonialism, even just within plants and the naming and all of those things like we're talking about now.
Totally. Uh, Fionn says that makes me think about the difference between invasive and introduced. Does anyone have a response to that?
I also like the using the term opportunistic. Like I didn't remember it being used within Earthseed, but I like opportunistic because I think it actually talks more about the plant's relationship with its ecology as opposed to it, not having agency in some ways. But Fionn is saying invasive is always bad, introduced may not necessarily be.
Cool. Yeah, I think that like going off what you said about the opportunistic, it feels like, plants also have their own agency and their own agendas for survival as well. And it's like how they'll always find somewhere to grow. Stephen, yeah, you want to talk about this, Stephen?
No, I was just saying on that same subject that mullein is a really potent herb for like colds and mucus, and it was brought over from Europe to indigenous lands here in America, and a lot of indigenous people called herbs like that and a few other ones, they called them white man's footsteps, because wherever the white man would go, those seeds would follow. So it was just really interesting. And eco art space, yeah, it's one of the lesser known uses for mullein is actually lower back pain. So it's really good that you know that.
Cool. Antispasmodic. Okay, cool. We can move on to this next question. So I kind of brought this up because in chapters 9 through 13, we see Lauren's community members consider leaving the compound for the company town of Olivar, a seaside municipality that's been taken over by a private corporation, KSF, that plans to expand a desalination plant in their efforts to privatize water as well as solar energy. So I kind of brought this up as a discussion question because I think it speaks to sort of the solutions that breed out of scarcity and when people are looking for safety and protection and stability. So I'm wondering, what your thoughts might be and how you in your communities and in your environment are negotiating scarcity now. Maybe I can start. I feel like I'm also from California, and I think that water scarcity is like a big dictator of how I think about the environment and how I interact with the environment. Like Stephen was saying, we've been having droughts for decades now, and I grew up, taking 5-minute showers or whatever. Like you weren't allowed to take anything more than that. And I think that having that mindset kind of shows you how we can adapt to scarcity and make it like I mean, this is too much information, but I still take really short showers because of that. But understanding water as a precious resource and the sort of cultural behaviors that can arise around that.
I think in kind of contrast to that, like living in Brooklyn where we live now, there's this kind of fear of too much, right? Like too much water. like I jokingly, not jokingly, I'm always talking about the potential for like a great flood. Like I've lived in New York for long enough to know that we live on an island. There's definitely floodplains here. And so I think there's also this kind of, there's both, it's kind of about like not having control in some ways, I feel like where there's the not being able to control how much water there is versus not being able to control how much, like too much water. Um, and I think that this kind of idea of like preparedness, is rooted in this conversation we're having today around like knowing our neighbors, like both our plant neighbors and our human neighbors. Like I don't know if Lauren would have been able to like, this is like in a different chapter, but like I don't know if she would have been able to like survive and leave without having to be able to do that in a kind of group, right? So uh anyhow, that's my thought about scarcity.
Yeah, I'm curious, like, maybe this is a question back to Stephen, but like, you kind of talked about how native plants are able to thrive, in spite of the changing conditions. And I wonder how you might see like plants finding abundance for themselves in conditions of scarcity. I think you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, let me just pull up, I want to pull up a piece that I actually just finished for a magazine called Pacific Horticulture. It's a magazine, horticulture magazine based on the West Coast, and they kind of talk about different ways that you can use native plants. Um, so I'm just going to read it here. So gardening taught me that, like life, a garden is ever changing. With each season comes new challenges and new growth, but with that growth comes the opportunity for fresh blooms. As I continue to nurture my own inner garden, I'm reminded and inspired by the resilience and adaptability of native California plants like the native California sagebrush, which is in the same family as mugwort. A shrubby plant that's also often known for encouraging dreamlike states and enhancing intuition. After a wildfire, it responds by resprouting from its roots and germinating from its seeds in the nutrient-rich ash. It was designed to go through the heat in order to recreate itself, much like a phoenix arising from the ashes after exploding in a ball of flames. We too are created to withstand the burning embers of transition and must sometimes go through the blaze to reestablish our roots, reorient our senses, and reemerge from the dirt stronger and more resilient than before. So that's a good example, the Artemisia california, or the California sagebrush, of a plant that is designed to withstand some of California's issues that we have with wildfire. And that's not the only one. There's a lot of plants that are designed to, specifically designed to be burnt so they can actually replenish and become more vigorous. Some other things, mutations that California plants have made are things like their leaves curl upwards. A lot of plants, like mugwort is a good example. In the heat, its leaves curl upwards, and it shows its gray kind of fuzzy exterior. And that's so that way, one, it doesn't absorb too much sun, so a lot of the water stays down into its roots. And two, it doesn't release as much water from its leaves, so it actually maintains a lot of that water internally. And there's a lot of adaptations like smaller leaves, reflective foliage to reflect some of the beams of the sun. And two other things that are important for native plants. One, which I think is interesting, is that they don't need really good soil. They actually thrive better in poor soil. Because of the type of soil that we have in Southern California, a lot of our plants will actually die if they're in too much nutrient-rich soil. So they really like poor soil, which is a really cool adaptability. And also, finally, obviously, they're drought tolerant. Like I mentioned before, a lot of them don't like any summer water. And a lot of them don't like any fall water. And that goes along with our natural climate in Southern California. We're a Mediterranean climate. So we get winter rain and we get summer drought. So a lot of our plants are adapted to that in native wildflowers, where we get going into our rainy season now, starting probably about today. It was kind of sprinkly today, and going into the springtime. So a lot of our plants are adapted to that climate. So we have a lot of plants that do have a lot of cool climate adaptations. And as climate change keeps on happening, I'm sure we'll find more and more plants that are going to keep on adapting and changing to the outside climate.
Cool. Yeah, so we're running, thank you so much, Stephen. We are running low on time, we're running near the end, so I wanted to point everyone's attention to some of the comments that have popped up in our chat. Yan says that their thoughts about how it might be connected to company towns and how in times of scarcity we seek community wherever we can, even if it is in that form. And also Eco Art Space says, as I understand it, non-natives and invasives show up where soils have been disturbed and provide nitrogen that soils need for the natives to return. And also shared a documentary about how to dance with aggressive plants, which I'll definitely be checking out. I wanted to thank Stephen again for joining us and all of you guys for coming together during this afternoon book club meeting. This is our second ever book club, so we're really excited to be in conversation with you all. Just before we head out, just wanted to let everyone know that if you RSVP'd, we will be sending a recording of this book club to you for you to review if you wanted to think back about some of the plant knowledge that Stephen dropped, and just to revisit the book as well. And we will be having our third installment on the 31st. It will be with Shakara Taylor, who is a farmer and agroecologist who runs the Black Dirt Farming Collective out of Detroit and is really invested in Black agriculture in that community as well. So we're really excited to share. And if you'd like to check out her piece, in addition to the next couple of chapters we're reading, it's up on Mold. So yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Hope to see you soon.
And I left my contact info for anybody who wants to get in contact with me. It's in the chat. If you want to send me an email.
Cool.
Yeah, cool. All right. Thank you guys. Bye.
Thank you.